identified and called members of the media, and we're also, I believe, live on Facebook, courtesy Hollis, Clifton. So good morning to all those who are viewing us on Facebook. And thank you very much for coming out to this physical video conference this morning. We actually haven't had a video conference here at the party office for quite some time in this physical way. We've been doing our video conferences over the last several months virtually, but we thought that we should get back in this environment every now and then, and I think we are hopefully going to be keeping ourselves safe from the COVID-19 virus. We wanted to speak to a number of issues this morning. Before I do that, I want to identify that there are 2 days that straddle today of international and local national significance. Yesterday was World AIDS Day, and we didn't make a statement on that day, but we do want as MSJ to express our solidarity and support for all those persons who are living with HIV/AIDS, and to say to everyone else in the country that they must ensure that they are safe, they practice safe sex, and ensure therefore they don't spread this disease any further. And we want to congratulate all of those persons in the healthcare sector who are working with persons with HIV/AIDS and making sure that it is no longer a death penalty and that people can live a full and fruitful and productive life for very many years given the medication that is now available. Secondly, tomorrow is International Day for people with disabilities, and I want to recognize in particular someone who passed away a number of years ago, but who championed this issue for Trinidad and Tobago, and that is the late George Daniel. As we know, George himself was a person who was differently able and fought many a battle on this particular issue to ensure that the rights of everyone who is differently able, that their rights are fully recognized and that they have the opportunity to live a full and productive life and contribute to themselves, their families, and to the society of Trinidad and Tobago generally. He had a major camp outside the National Flour Mills on Wrightson Road that went on for several weeks to highlight the issue. He was on the steps of the Hall of Justice to indicate the fact that at that time nobody could access the Hall of Justice if they were in a wheelchair unless somebody physically lifted them up those steps and so on. And he highlighted that issue and others going to the United Nations to witness a major UN document recognizing the right of people with disabilities. And I remember him being very saddened by the fact that there was nobody from Trinidad and Tobago's government at that time to represent the government and to sign on to this important declaration and treaty, in a sense, recognizing the rights of people with disabilities. So I want to remember George Daniel and the struggles that he fought. When I was president of FITON, the DPI, Disabled People's International TT chapter, was a member of FITON, and we campaigned and struggled together, so we want to recognize tomorrow as an important day. Before I get into the issue of many of the injustices that exist in Trinidad and Tobago, let me also announce that on Sunday, this coming Sunday, starting at 2 p.m., the MSJ is going to be having our National Assembly. This is an important activity. We were originally scheduled to have a party congress, which is our major constitutional requirement, a party congress. But because of COVID and all of the challenges that COVID raises for organizing an event like a congress where one has to engage in discussion of reports and so much more, we decided to postpone the Congress to next year, And that decision was taken by the party's activist council, and we meet generally virtually as an activist council. But we, therefore, in place of the Congress, we felt that it was necessary to bring our members together to interact, to assess the year 2020. Of course, we had a general election campaign in August this year. Last year, November, we had local government elections. And so quite a bit has happened within the last year and a half or so. And we thought it was necessary, the democracy of the party, to have a party assembly. And that will be this Sunday at 2 o'clock. We actually will be affording our activists and members the opportunity to join it by way of a Zoom webinar. And for those who are unable to do so, they can follow it live on Facebook, because it will be live on Facebook. So they also open to the public in the sense of see the MSJ's activity and democracy in action on Sunday at 2 o'clock. So that's our National Assembly. And I thought I would take the opportunity of this press conference this morning to inform the public that the party organs, the party's activities, the party's members are very real. And in fact, our theme is real, relevant, and reinvigorated. That's our theme for our assembly on Sunday. Real, because MSJ is real. We are not a figment of anybody's imagination. We did not disappear on the night of August 10th, notwithstanding the fact that we lost the elections and our candidates didn't get a lot of votes. But we did not disappear. You haven't heard from all those other parties that contested. They have virtually disappeared. MSJ is here. We are here to stay. We are continuing to build. And therefore, we are real. We are relevant because we are speaking to the issues that affect people on the ground. And we have done so in very many ways, not only through our press conferences, but we have had a number of webinars, very important webinars on issues ranging from the patriotic acquisition of the Point-of-Care refinery, that whole issue, to the issue of of the U.S. elections. We had a major webinar on the U.S. elections and its implications. We had a series of 3 webinars on the national budget, the only party that had a series of webinars and discussions on the national budget. We had 3, 2 before the budget and 1 after the budget. All of that happened after the general elections. So we are very relevant. And we have initiated Tuesday Talk with the MSJ, and that has been happening consistently over the last 2 months or so. Up till yesterday evening, Tuesday Talk was conducted by our deputy political leader, Radical Paul Bance, on the issue of survival of small and micro enterprises in the country. A very, very interesting one. And I think I've done 2. The Joint Secretary Warwick has done. Our youth officer, Angelo Hart, has done a couple. Elections officer, Ernesto Kiza, has done at least 1. So we've had quite a number of Tuesday Talks. And therefore we are relevant, dealing with the issues of the day. And we are reinvigorated because, well, I will keep some of that back for the assembly. And of course, the media is invited. We will send you the link so you can join it via Zoom on the webinar. And of course, as you know, with Zoom, we send you the cloud recording subsequently. And of course, you could also look at it live on Facebook. But I will make a major statement about the direction of the party and the strategy of the party for 2021, having regard to the discussions and the assessments that we had immediately after the elections in the middle of August. I can say that on Sunday there was an activity which is an independent activity of the party. It's not an MSJ activity, it's an independent activity, but the initiative came from the MSJ when we launched the Lennox Oscar Pierre and John LaRose Foundation. There's a Facebook page up, and I did send all of you the invitation belatedly to that launch, and I hope that you can still go up and view it. Very, very important foundation that will be doing work going into 2021 in terms of building awareness and consciousness in the country. So we are real, we are relevant, and we are reinvigorated. So that's our National Assembly on Sunday at 2 p.m. and we will send invitations to the media as usual. Let me now turn to the issue of injustice in the country. The headlines in the media, both print and electronic, over the last several weeks have been filled with all kinds of stories. We ourselves as MSJ, we have not had a media conference or issued a media statement on many of these issues, not because we were unconcerned, not because they're not of national importance, or not because MSJ did not have something to say, but we really were focusing on some other critical matters that we have responsibility for. And sometimes it's good to allow a little water to flow under the bridge before one speaks to these things. So I first want to congratulate the Faculty of Law at the University of the West Indies here at St. Augustine and its Dean, Professor Rosemary Bell Antwine, for the initiative that they have taken to file legal action, constitutional motions, and I believe they're being supported by the Proper Foundation, so I also want to congratulate the Proper Foundation and all the others in this very innovative and historic move to file constitutional motions with respect to the long periods of time which persons who have been charged with one crime or the other and who are on awaiting trial in prison, in remand yard, for years and have not had their matter determined either by the magistrate's court and so on. So they are on remand. This is a situation which really is in violation of the human rights of citizens to be held essentially without trial, almost indefinitely, because it is one thing to be told that you will go on trial, but if you have not had your matter heard or determined for 5, 10, 15 years, in effect, that is not only justice denied, because we know justice delayed is justice denied, but in effect you are being held in detention without trial. All justice systems in democratic countries are clear that persons must not be held in detention without trial. So we want to support and congratulate that initiative by the Faculty of Law here at St. Augustine, UE, led by Professor Rosemary Bell Antwine. So that's the first thing I want to speak to with respect to some of the issues of injustice that have been highlighted with respect to the criminal justice system in Trinidad and Tobago. The second one, of course, has been this debate between, or not necessarily between, around the issue of what constitutes a public event and what constitutes a private event at which many persons are congregating in this time of COVID. Now, we are aware that the public health regulations say that we must not gather in numbers of more than whatever, and therefore, when you have a large gathering like a party or whatever it is, a fete, then that is in contravention of the public health regulations. But there has now been this distinction between persons who have a private event and persons who have, quote unquote, a public event. And the examples that we have had of private events are events that are held on the properties of persons who are affluent, who are more wealthy, more well-to-do in the country. And those examples of persons who have been found to be in a public event are quite clearly persons who are not affluent. These are ordinary people, many of them maybe unemployed youths and so on. They are essentially from the working class. So we have had this distinction by economic and social class, and quite notably too, in some cases, by ethnicity, where people who were charged, for example, in the party up in St. Helena, were primarily Afro-Trinidadians, people of African descent, people who were down in Bayshore, wherever it was, in a birthday party around a pool, were quite clearly of European descent, or perhaps of Syrian Lebanese descent. They were white Trinidadians or perhaps foreigners. So you get these very clear distinctions by ethnicity and by social and economic categories. Now, that of course has therefore raised issues about whether there's one justice system for one group of people and a different justice system for another group of people. And we have heard both the government ministers and the Commissioner of Police, in a sense, hiding behind a fine legal definition of a private event in a private property, where we are now learning, though we were not told that at the beginning of the pandemic, where we are now learning that you can basically do anything there, and you're not necessarily breaking the law. Now, this reinforces the sense, both perception and reality, of the fact that we have a justice system that does not dispense justice fairly and equally to different sections of the national community. That those perhaps who have resources to hire the best lawyers in town are better able to be defended before the courts than those who do not have resources and end up without proper legal advice, ending up being incarcerated, or perhaps either wrongfully or incarcerated for longer periods than they ought to be, simply because they did not have the best legal advice, because they could not afford it. So we, in this country, we have to ensure that the laws as written and implemented in such a way that there can be no perception or reality of inequality or injustice in how the laws are being implemented. Very, 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 very serious matter, because once that sense of inequality exists, once people feel that they are discriminated against, once there is actual discrimination in how people are treated, once there is no equality of citizens before the law, then the outcome of that will be that people will have no respect for the law, break the law, and therefore we will degenerate into more and more of a lawless society. So we are calling on the government to ensure that there can be no violations of the public health regulations of gatherings of people, regardless of whether those gatherings are in a so-called public place or so-called private place. Yes? Now, whether they then use public health inspectors, whatever it is, to ensure that people observe the public health protocols, whatever has to be done, ought to be done, without necessarily violating people's constitutional rights to the enjoyment of their property. I want to now lastly turn to the issue of migration, because this has been a very hot issue over the last 10 days or so. More particularly, it's been a hot issue for quite some time, but it has come back to the fore over the last 10 days or so. And in a sense, it's a very good thing that this press conference is today, following Justice Sipasa's judgment yesterday in the High Court. And made some important determinations. He said that the persons who enter here illegally, as an important thing, do not and cannot have the rights of a refugee. Now, we made this point, MSJ made this point very, very clearly. I think it may have been 2 years ago. And I wrote a very long statement on it, and the print media actually carried it slightly abbreviated in three parts over 3 days. All three newspapers, to my recollection, carried it, where I was making the distinction between migrant workers and refugees. And there are people in this country who are continuing to push the false idea that all the persons who come in from Venezuela are refugees, and therefore they must be granted asylum or be given refugee status. And we are very clear that persons coming in from Venezuela have come in essentially as migrant workers. They want to come and work for economic, to get some money, to maybe send back to Venezuela or to take care of themselves. Migrant workers are a very different category to a refugee or someone who is being given asylum, because a refugee or somebody who is being given asylum then has the right, same right, as a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago. And therefore we support the position taken by the government. That, in fact, we put out that even before the government had said it publicly. I've said two years ago, I wrote a very detailed statement of this, explaining it very carefully, that we cannot have persons coming in here as refugees or give them political asylum, because then we would be burdening the state of Trinidad and Tobago with the responsibility of treating all of those persons as if they were citizens of this country. So that's the first point I want to make. And there's a lot of misinformation being put out there in order to try to win public support. And I think Justice Sipasad made the point clearly yesterday that the persons who have come in do not, or are not classified, they do not fall within the category of refugees under the United Nations treaties and so on. The second point in relation to this is that in our view it was unfortunate that the state agencies, whether it was immigration or the Coast Guard or whoever, if they were aware last weekend, but not weekend one, the weekend before, if they were aware that there was a matter of habeas corpus before the court, with respect to, I think it was 26 Venezuelans, including some women and children, that came in illegally, and there was a habeas corpus matter being filed. It was very unfortunate that they would have been returned to Venezuela while legal action was being filed. In our view, that habeas corpus matter ought to have been heard and determined before they were sent back. In other words, if I know that there's a court matter and I take action, right, that would make that court matter null and void, and I do it quickly, that is wrong. One should allow the court matter to be determined, and then to, on the basis of the court's decision, to take whatever action is necessary. So that was unfortunate. That created, I think, a certain emotional welling up of support for those 26 persons who were sent out and then they eventually came back in and so on. So sometimes the government agencies, state agencies I should say, state agencies, when they act, if they do not act carefully, they make matters worse than they were before. That was very unfortunate. The third point I want to make is in response to a story that appeared in Sunday's Express, where the US ambassador, Mr. Mandela, was being critical of Trinidad and Tobago and other CARICOM countries with respect to persons coming into this country and the human rights situation. Mr. Mandela has absolutely no moral authority, zero, to open his mouth on this question, because it is well known that the government which he represents, the administration that he represents, the Trump administration, was separating children from their parents who came in together at the border, US-Mexico border. They arrived together. They may have not only arrived, they may have crossed the border illegally and gone to other parts of the United States. And then they were separated from their parents. And their parents were deported, and children were being kept in cages. We all saw that publicly. Kept in cages. And up to now, there are children whose parents cannot be located. So there are children in the United States being held in detention, and nobody knows where their parents are because their parents were deported and the children have been separated. Mr. Mandela, hush your mouth, please. You have no right, no moral authority, and no right to speak about how we are dealing with migrant people here in Trinidad and Tobago. And then he's talking about elections, and the Venezuela elections on Sunday are not democratic. Well, maybe he should tell his friend, Mr. Trump, who he financed, because Mandela is a financier of Trump. He should tell Mr. Trump that he should concede the elections to Mr. Biden and stop all the nonsense that he's doing in the United States, challenging what clearly, and saying that the elections are fraudulent and stolen and whatever. So Mandela, tell your partner Trump about elections and leave Venezuela out of it. You have no moral authority to tell anybody about elections anywhere. You have lost that moral authority. So that's the last thing I want to make. I really got into the election thing, but really the focus was on the US having no moral authority to tell anybody about migrants and how children are being treated when the US has a horrific, horrendous record in this regard. It's public knowledge and so on. Okay? So those are the statements I want to make, and of course, as usual, I'm open to questions.
Mr. Abdulah, the issue with the immigration of the 26 people before, I mean, do you think all of that is a consequence of law enforcement agencies or the state not being able to properly secure the borders to allow these products to come in? I mean, if they had a properly secured border, it would not accomplish something like that?
Well, quite clearly, yes. I mean, our borders are not totally secure. That's very obvious. But the fact is that there are quite a few people who are being either turned back on the sea, or when they land, they are being detained and sent back. I think a few days ago, 160 persons were returned to Venezuela. So there are efforts by the law enforcement agencies of the state to deal with this. The fact is that it is very difficult to completely seal our maritime borders given the close proximity of Trinidad to Venezuela. It's difficult. More has to be done though. Much more has to be done. Not only with respect to migrants, but we are getting, as part of the migration, there is quite clearly other illegal activity, human trafficking, drug running, arms and ammunition, and so on. So all of that is criminality and has to be addressed as well. So it's not only the issue of persons coming into work who want to try to secure some economic benefit for themselves and their family, but there are illegal activities taking place. And I did see in the press a report which apparently the media got wind of and got a hold of some report that had been done by a Canadian firm for CARICOM, with respect to the issue of migrants, and it was suggesting that there are criminal elements here in Trinidad and Tobago as well that are involved in this illegal trade of people, of drugs, of arms and so on, and including persons within the security forces. So we have a lot of things on our plate to deal with, and we are calling the government and the Commissioner of Police and all the heads of the security agencies to make sure that not only are our borders secured as best as possible, but that criminal activity is dealt with. And let me say as I'm speaking to that we disagreed with the UNC when they decided to abstain on the Anti-Gang Act, the continuation of the Anti-Gang Act. That act was not an act in perpetuity. There was a sunset clause. It was going to last for another 2.5 years, and the UNC provided no evidence as to why the act should be discontinued. In other words, if, as they claim, there could be abuses by the police and so on with respect to persons being charged or held without bail for offences under the Anti-Gang Act, then they ought to have provided some evidence of that. They were asking the government to provide evidence of it working. Well, if they were against it, they should have also provided hard evidence of it being abused. And I saw no such evidence being presented in the Parliament or outside of the Parliament on that. And quite clearly, we do need to have that anti-gang legislation, not forever, because dealing with the problem of criminal violence and gangs is not purely an issue of suppression, but law enforcement. It is also an issue of the economic and social conditions of people. But it would have been useful to have had that act continue. And there could have been a compromise, if not for 2.5 years. They could have discussed and agreed to go with a year or some such thing to at least allow some more time for the country to evaluate the usefulness or otherwise of that piece of legislation.
Do you expect an easing of sanctions by Biden administration towards the easing of sanctions and improvement in relationship?
Okay, that's a major one. I certainly expect that the Biden administration will return the relationship between the United States and Cuba to the situation that existed when President Obama and Vice President Biden left office in January 2017. And at that time, the sanctions had not been completely removed because the embargo or the blockade is implemented by an act of Congress, and therefore only the Congress can reverse it. However, there were executive orders that President Obama implemented, which enabled more people to travel to Cuba more easily, enabled money being moved by people in the United States, wire transfers to Cuba by Western Union and things like that. So those things were being freed up. Cruise ships were going to Cuba out of Miami. There were flights out of the United States, so a lot of the restrictions were being eased up by way of executive order. And Trump reversed all of those by his executive orders. So I expect that President Biden will reverse what Trump did by executive order, so at least there will be some greater normalization of the relationship between Cuba and the United States. And depending on what happens with the Senate races, if the Democrats win the 2 seats in Georgia in January, perhaps it would be possible for the Congress to repeal the Helms-Burton Act and the other Torricelli Acts and the other acts that have imposed the blockade against Cuba. With respect to Venezuela, I cannot say whether those will be, the sanctions will be removed. I certainly would hope that the Biden administration would move to a position of engagement so that there could be discussions as per the CARICOM policy and Norway to have negotiated settlements of the crisis in Venezuela between the government and the opposition. And the opposition in Venezuela is not a unified opposition, there's many different parties. But we hope that there could be some easing of the economic pressures on Venezuela so that the money that was seized by the United States illegally, because done unilaterally, that is owned by Venezuela, that money could be eased up so that the Venezuelan government would have the wherewithal to deal with the social problems that people have.
I want to go back to the first issue that you raised about people being held on remand for indefinite period. My question is, if someone has been on remand for, let's say, 10, 12 years for an offense they allegedly commit, but on the law books, the penalty for such an offense is about 5 years, what redress does such a person have?
I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I certainly would think that this might be one of the grounds on which this matter will be argued going forward. I'm not aware of what the details of the legal submissions are, but certainly I think that will be one good ground. Now, I recall that Archbishop Joseph Harris, some couple of years ago, did propose that persons who are on remand and whose sentence would not have exceeded the period that they have already been on remand should all be released, because in fact they have served the time. They have been deprived of their liberty and they have served the time. And I don't think that was taken up. The only initiative was during this COVID period here, the Attorney General and Minister of National Security announced that persons who were on relatively minor charges would be released. Now, I heard the Prison Officers Association President, Sarah Richards, say that in fact did not take place. So, particularly in this COVID period, and I did not hear the government respond to that and say whether that didn't happen. So it seems as if there's been a gap between what the government's announced policy was and what actually has happened. And that gap should be closed right away. Cindy?
Yeah, Ms. Abdulah, I just want to clarify something. So you're saying that you agree with the government when they're saying migrants can be a strain on the state, as well as you're asking for the borders to be closed, and you're making this differentiation between migrant workers and refugees. So is it that you're open, or you think that we should allow migrant workers but not refugees? Can you just explain the differentiation in your stance?
Yeah. Okay, so it is first of all a legal distinction. So someone who is granted refugee status by a country then effectively becomes a citizen of the country in terms of their legal rights. They have the same legal rights as a citizen. And so you do not want to have people being declared refugees. Now, refugees generally are persons who are fleeing war and famine and major natural disaster catastrophes, where it becomes absolutely impossible for them to live in their country, right? And so, particularly war, where people are being massacred, genocide, people are being killed and so on, or being caught in a civil war, villages being burned down, and things like that, and you get persons becoming refugees in those circumstances, like perhaps what's happening in Syria, where you had actual warfare taking place, people's towns, cities were being destroyed, they couldn't live there, bombs were falling, children were getting legs blown off by landmines and so on. That is a situation where people have to move and they then become refugees. Now that's very different from where a country where there may be economic difficulties, and people then say, well listen, I feel I could have a better life across the border, because across the border the business is booming, people will employ me and so on, right? And therefore people come in as migrant workers. Or when, for example, some migrant workers are seasonal. Right now we have migrant workers in Canada who want to come back. Now, some of them were told, don't go, But they so wanted to go during the COVID thing, but they wanted to work. But when they got up there now, how did they get back? But they were also, some migrant workers are also terribly exploited. You go there and then you work, you live in bad conditions, and so on. So you have seasonal migrant workers and you have some permanent migrant workers, right? And migrant workers essentially are important to the economy because they may be performing jobs which either there's a shortage of labor nationally or where nationals do not want to do that work. All right, so migrant workers can in fact be positive. And if you look at the history of the United States, of England after the Second World War, there was a huge migration out of the Caribbean to West Indies, to England, and the migrant workers in England, the so-called Windrush generation, ensured post-war England was developed. Hollis would be aware because he lived in the UK in that period in the 60s. They ran the bus and metro system, the underground. There were nurses in the hospitals all over the country. West Indian migrant workers were essential to the economic development of the UK. So migrant workers can be useful. They then pay taxes. They could then, all migrant workers, the government did not provide for that in the registration, but they could be paying taxes or NIS, and therefore some of them go back, some of them end up staying and building a life here. We have migrant workers from Venezuela for the cocoa industry years ago. That's how we have Param, right? So we had that. We've had migrant workers from Grenada and St. Vincent coming in to work in the oil fields. From Labray going down to Point was St. Vincent and Grenada. We had them coming in to work on the base. So people like how Lamatil, then people came in from Grenada and St. Vincent. So we have had our own experience of people coming in from other places as migrant workers and then laying down roots. And that's very, very different now to people claiming refugee status, because once you say that persons from Venezuela landing here are by definition refugees, then everyone who comes in will be defined and declared a refugee, and everyone will then get status as a citizen, as if they were a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago. And that is not, first of all, they're not refugees, and second of all, we just cannot manage having that type of situation.
But also the borders are closed, and so what are they coming out? Migrant workers? Because
right now they're coming in illegally. Right. So some people came in legally before the borders were closed, like years ago. They got flights, they came in Cedros legally because there was a legal port at Cedros, and they would come in and they were given 6 months. Because anybody coming into Trinidad and Tobago, you could get 6 months, right? But then they overstayed. So some came and went, some stayed. And then you had others who came in illegally and stayed. Now, it was those persons that the government last year sought to have registered. Those who either came in and overstayed their 6 months, or those who came in illegally at the start, but were living here. The government said, okay, you have up until a particular date to get yourself regularized and registered. If you get yourself regularized and registered by this date, you then have a year in which you can work here as a migrant worker legally. And that year has now been extended, or is to be extended, because the COVID pandemic, the year should have ended in June or something, or July, and the COVID pandemic was raging and still raging, so the government is saying we are looking at extending that. They didn't say for a year or whatever it is. So those persons will now be your migrant workers. Everybody else who came in after June or July 2019 without a visa, because the government also then imposed a visa restriction on Venezuelans coming into Trinidad, because the borders weren't closed. But everybody who came in without a visa came in illegally. Or if they came in on a visa and overstayed their time, they're illegal.
Okay. You said it was unfortunate the situation where there was a habeas corpus before the court, and
But it was, I don't know if it was actually before the court. They were in the process of doing it. I think the attorneys, I think, did inform, according to the attorneys, immigration that they were going to be filing the habeas corpus.
No, after that situation where the migrants came and they were deported,
Excuse me.
yeah.
Go ahead, sorry. I thought you just said that. Go ahead.
Yeah, we saw the defense of that action by the Prime Minister and the Minister of National Security. The every court which we spoke of GSC to convene to get some answers into why that happened. Obviously, one is to ensure that it's not only government officials who oversee what happened. I mean, we think it's necessary to find out what went wrong and whether there was a blatant disregard for the court or whether it was a communication error.
Yeah, I think it was important. I think it is important for the country to know exactly what the facts are. Did the immigration officials have the information that habeas corpus proceedings were being filed? Was there any communication as to timelines for the persons to be sent back quickly to make the habeas corpus null and void? I think we need to know those facts. Whether it comes out in a joint select committee or whether it comes out in some other legal action, I can't say, but I do think that public officials need to be accountable, and so that we can know the truth of the situation.
One last thing.
Yeah.
So, enjoyment of property is a constitutional right.
Yes.
Now, I know there are ways to infringe or temporarily infringe on constitutional rights. How do you propose Parliament goes about seeking to control gatherings and private residence? Because I understand you're saying that, yes, people are being arrested in public areas for breach of the public health violation. And the public health ordinance for COVID, as the minister said, is to protect lives. It doesn't mean that if all of us in this private residence here gather and party, it doesn't mean that legally it might be correct. I mean, we can't get arrested, but we're still putting ourselves at risk of spreading COVID. I mean, how do you think the government could go about in getting...
Yeah, no, I heard the Minister of Health, and I'm not saying that this is what has to be done, I'm not saying that we support that, but I did hear the Minister of Health say that public health officers, public health inspectors, I think they're called, right, have the right to enter any private property if they believe there's a violation of the public health regulations. In other words, you're running a restaurant and the kitchen, nasty. The public health inspector is private property, but the public health inspectors can go into the kitchen and look for cockroach and rats and other vermin or food not being properly stored and so on. And they could shut you down, right? So that may be an option, that if you are gathering in large numbers, then you are in fact causing a public health problem. Because, and not only for yourselves, but for other people, because you might be in a private wedding, yeah, or Christmas line, and it's 40 people at backyard line, around jamming, people drinking, and so on. There's 40, 50 people in the backyard line, right? And you figure that's good, that's my private thing, it's just my family. But those 40 people, if one of them is positive for COVID, then spreads it to the others, then those 30 or 40 then go out into the wider public to work and so on. All of a sudden, from 1 to 30 to 300, that's how the spread goes, right? So people, ought to be more sensible so that they do not engage in activity that is injurious or dangerous to their own health and that of their families and friends and co-workers and the general public. B, it may be that the public health inspectors can stop those activities. It may be, but as I said, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to give a definitive statement, but that might be one way of going about it.
But you have that backyard line. A public health inspector comes to your gate. have the option of letting that person in or not because it's a constitutional right to enjoy the property and the security of the property.
Yeah, but if you are in violation of the law, the public health regulations would say that you must have a gathering of more than 10 or 20.
In a public place.
Yes, but okay, yes, and that is the fine line that then emerges.
Right, so are you...
That then becomes a fine line that emerges.
So are you therefore saying that Parliament should find some way to restrict gatherings and private properties? Because it still poses that same danger.
Yeah,
in a public
right. In other words, it may be necessary. I'm saying it may be necessary to go there. Now, the ideal thing is, of course, for people to not gather. But if people don't do it voluntarily, then it may be necessary. But and this is where you would have to have some real discussion between stakeholders like the Law Association and others. In other words, if I have a private party, which I do every year, right? I didn't have it this year because of COVID, at my house. It's a private party, it says very clearly on the invitation, this is my invitation only, right? And I have it in my yard. Do I have that right to do that kind of nonsense, right? Or should that be stopped?
But you know, the country has been a sort of lockdown for the entire year. You know, Christmas is a period of time, you know, new line. It's a time of 2020. Do you foresee that people will take that chance?
There may be some people who will, but let's hope that people are sensible. And if we could manage the COVID spread well, then I'm sure that the numbers of persons who could gather will be increased accordingly. Okay? I think I've said quite a bit this morning. I don't know if I could repeat or say it differently.
That's it, but I just want to confirm, right? Is it fair to say that you agree with the 160 being deported because of the government's reasoning?
Yes, because they came in illegally, yes.
So you agree with it, right?
Yes, they came in illegally.
Stay there with the phone.